Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Runeterra Report, Mastering Runeterra's weekly podcast filling you in on everything you'll need to know for the upcoming week of Runeterra at a breakneck pace. I'm your host, DarwinTheory, NA Masters player and two-time Seasonals attendee, here to guide you through the meta for the week of January 2nd, 2022. I hope you've all had a merry holiday season. Without any further ado, let's dive right back in and explore what you'll have to keep an eye on for this week of Runeterra. As with the last 2 weeks, AQV is on top of the mountain and it isn't close. The deck's matchup spread is thoroughly ridiculous, losing exactly one matchup against popular decks, that being Bandle Vayne. Aatrox's Girl Scouts are without a doubt the most dominant deck to pick up if the sole goal is making that LP number skyrocket. While they're both growing in popularity, I'm still of the opinion that not enough players run one copy of Condemn and a full set of Zealous Ranger Knights. In the most optimized versions of the deck list, those cards are enabled to their fullest potential through repeated attacks with equipped units. AQV has the highest win rate and highest play rate deck in the meta, indicative of a Titan that's here to stay until it gets nerfed. And while AQV has undeniably taken its place upon the mountaintop for several weeks now, the race for the silver medal's been tight, and we've finally seen Bandle Bar slip from its spot. The number 2 most played deck in the meta is now Red Gwen, which boasts a similar, albeit worse, matchup spread to Aatrox Vayne. Even or winning matchups against most popular decks, except for Discard and Bandle Bar, means that competent players will love the chance that Red Gwen gives them to win nearly any game with enough skill. Crimson Pigeon and Legion Rearguard are fantastic 1-drops that in my opinion aren't run nearly enough. This deck can be built in an aggressive fashion, and with such strong 1-drops available, it really seems like a waste not to use them in conjunction. Bizarrely, Mark of the Isles far outperforms Shadow Isles Tellstones in this archetype, probably because the extra 1 mana is useful, and because Red Gwen isn't likely to use the other 2 Tellstone options anyways. For those who aren't a fan of AQV, but who want a similarly versatile matchup spread, Red Gwen is undoubtedly a solid aggressive choice that will net you some LP. And while it's no longer the definitive number 2 option in the game, Bandle Bar is far from irrelevant. Its matchup spread is far more polarizing than the above options, getting absolutely crushed by AQV and Kaayntrox while dominating Discard, Red Gwen, Lurk, and Ephemerals. I was a fan of Cosmic Binding before, and the stats continue to back up my opinions in a growing sample size. While it's not as cheap as the rest of the deck, this is a very solid one-of that can make a huge difference in some matchups when drawn. One hard copy of Aftershock is doing great as well, since Aftershock crushes your bar mirrors and it's an efficient standalone removal as is. While not infallible by any means, Bandle Bar is definitely the top combo control deck in the meta, and the heavy concentration of removals is definitely enough to totally shut down a lot of decks' game plans. And while always seemingly playing second fiddle to the better Aatrox deck, that being Aatrox Vayne Demacia, Kaayntrox is far from unviable in its own right. A severely unfavored matchup against AQV, Lurk, and Bandle Vayne aren't the most encouraging signs, but Kaayntrox does crush Bandle Bar, and it goes toe-to-toe with Red Gwen and Discard. The deck list has progressively become tighter and tighter with the passage of time, but some versions of the deck do swap in Shadowblade Fanatic in 2 or 3 copies, and it looks like it can definitely perform. As stated previously, the Expanse's protection is also potentially underutilized in at least 1 copy, and those who aren't using it should keep it in mind. It's become standard for many versions of the deck now. For those Kayn lovers out there, this is definitely your best option to take to ladder. Kayn Demacia is not looking as good as it used to. And the 5th most played deck to fill out our top 5 is yet another familiar face. Tumbling Rumble doesn't seem to be going anywhere quite so long as Aatrox dominates the game. The archetype's matchup spread is a bit more polarizing than some of those seen above, crushing the 2 popular Aatrox decks, but very disadvantaged against Bandle Bar and some weaker fringe options. The deck is also adapting, getting a few new toys that seem to be pushing up its win rate by a lot. Catch, Field Promotion, Might, and Condemn all look to be intriguing options. With equipment destruction more prevalent now than ever thanks to Aatrox Demacia, 1 or 2 copies of Might are a good alternative when the great hammers would fail you. Considering that the meta is not as top-heavy as we've seen in the past, with the top 5 archetypes making up only just under a third of decks, Bandle Vayne's targeting strategy is not absurdly strong, but with that being said, it's still undeniably the best pick if your pocket meta's full of big red and you just need a deck that'll shut down Aatrox as easily as possible. And now to look at some of the most underrated and underplayed decks that are performing at a top level for this patch. Despite a measly 1% pick rate, Spider Gwen does seem to be one of the best performers, crushing it with a 57% win rate. Matchup data is limited for this deck, but it only seems truly disadvantaged to Jinx Lulu, with every other matchup looking, at the very least, winnable. Much like Discard, this is another deck that's been revolutionized by the Crimson Pigeon Reveler's Feast combo. This deck forgoes a lot of the old Spider's Core, playing a more swarm and burn-oriented game plan that definitely seems to work in its favor more than the old Fearsome spam. The deck list is pretty tight, so my only recommendations would be to make sure you've included 3 copies each of Pigeon and Feast. They seem to be the best cards in the deck, and they've revolutionized the archetype's game plan to make it one of the best niche climbing options in this New Year's meta. And Spider-Gwen is far from the only viable Noxus aggro bringing in the new year. Draven Jinx discard is still the real deal, folks. A severely unfavored matchup against Bandle Bar is made up for by some unfair 60 to 70% win rates against more fringe options, which is a good thing in a meta that's not overwhelmingly top-heavy. Interestingly, it does seem that classic Noxus aggro pieces are the best performing components of the deck. Saboteur, Rearguard, Pigeon, and Crowd Favorite are all very strong units that are performing exceptionally well in place of some of the more classic discard pieces. Parts Made Whole has made a splash in EMEA, if I recall correctly, but the stats shown here are mediocre at best. Reveler's Feast is now actually performing below average in the deck stat-wise, which is a concerning trend that might indicate that the archetype needs to be solved a bit further. I would say I'm still a fan of 1 or maybe 2 copies of Reveler's Feast, but use it with caution. Noxus aggro archetypes seem to be dominating the fringes of the meta, and this deck is one of the best at doing so. And even more interesting is the return to the limelight from an old favorite, Pirate Aggro, the third Noxus aggro deck in the top 5 win rates. Again, limited stats here, but it's yet another aggressive option that targets the fringes. Doesn't beat AQV, Kaayntrox, Bandle Bar, or Red Gwen convincingly, but it crushes many of the weaker options. This is probably the least solved of the 3 Noxus aggro archetypes on Vogue, featuring a lot of solid options with low play rates. Island Navigator, Double Up, Battlecaster, and the Pigeon Feast Crimson combo are all pieces that perform very well in the archetype, but none of them are standard. Puzzlingly, there's also this Buru Cultist performing very well, but the deck doesn't really seem to have room for any equipment, so I'm going to chalk that one up to a fluke for the time being. If I see more play rate, I'll analyze it a bit deeper next week. Bully decks are a very solid choice right now, and pirates love to get away with some bullying when it comes to the weaker archetypes and the fringes of the meta. And not a Noxus aggro, but another bullying aggressive archetype all the same, Jinx Lulu has never quite disappeared from the meta since the expansion dropped, and it continues to hang on by preying on many weaker archetypes and even one of the top archetypes as well. It dominates Red Gwen, smashes several other options around the top 5 to 15 play rate range, while losing to AQV and being slightly disadvantaged against Bandle Bar and Kaayntrox. This deck is performing very well with single copies of Augmented Experimenter and Electro Harpoon in limited sample sizes, and with the rest of the deck list being so tight, I would definitely recommend trying to make room for 1 or 2 slots to try filling with those cards. Bully aggros are definitely the flavor of the week, and I would recommend this one in a heartbeat to anybody who loves their chompers but doesn't enjoy the classic Noxus aggro go-face stratagems. And with those decks covered, it's time for everybody's favorite segment once again. The RHP has returned, and some familiar faces are on the pile this time around. Ephemerals and Sundisk continue to humiliate themselves, with generally bad matchups among the top decks and without necessarily making up for it against the weaker parts of the field either. Rise is still awful beyond belief without a single deck near relevant win rate territory. Azir Targon Zolani is a meme deck sporting a humiliating win rate, which gets even hilariously worse when Kale is added to the mix, and it should only be touched in norms. Stay away from that one in ranked. I didn't think I'd ever cover a deck worse than Reaver's Row, but Azir Targon definitely fits the bill. Speaking of Kale, her pairings with Bard, Gwen, and Braum are also massive disappointments as of right now. Gwen Irelia looks to be more and more mediocre as the days go by, and the resurgence of Katarina Yasuo seems to be a failure as the deck embarrasses itself in terms of win rate and matchups. Well, everyone, that'll be just about everything for this week's Runeterra report here on Mastering Runeterra. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening right until the end. If you have any questions or concerns about the podcast, please feel free to hit me up through the Mastering Runeterra Discord or personally at DarwinTheory9305. Massive shoutouts to MasteringRuneterra.com for making this happen, as well as every individual affiliated with the site who helped me piece together the data that I needed for this podcast. Other special shoutouts go to the folks behind LOR.GG, as well as Legna's website for matchup data. Gathering data isn't easy, but when I can cross-reference with such reliable sources, it's a massive help to make sure that I know what I'm talking about is correct. The folks at Mastering Runeterra post quite often, so if you aren't already a regular, I'd highly recommend you swing by and see what's in store. We've got meta tier lists, matchup spreads, and a best of 3 ban helper for you tournament players out there, all updated every few hours to ensure that we've got the best data out there. We also have articles posted by top players who know their stuff nearly every single day, so you'll be sure to find something you like no matter where you look. This has been Darwin Theory, and on behalf of everyone at Mastering Runeterra, I'd like to thank you for tuning in and wish you all a successful week of laddering. I hope to see you back next week as we continue the road to our first seasonal tournament in months. Happy climbing!